In 2009, an American team led by archaeologist Nick Bellantoni analyzed DNA from a skull fragment preserved in Soviet archives in Moscow. The result was baffling. It did not belong to Hitler, but to a young woman. The revelation cast doubt on one of the most iconic pieces of evidence regarding the dictator's death. However, in 2018, French forensic scientist Philippe Charlier examined the teeth attributed to Hitler and confirmed that the dentures and dental markings could match historical records. Even so, the debate remains open. The contradictions in Soviet archives, the misidentification of the skull, and the theories linking the disappearance of submarine U-3523 to a possible escape toward Patagonia continue fueling a disturbing question: what really happened to the Führer's remains? The unknowns do not end there. In 2011, before dawn on July 20th, anniversary of the Operation Valkyrie assassination attempt, authorities secretly exhumed Rudolf Hess's grave in Wunsiedel and scattered his ashes at sea to erase the neo-Nazi shrine that attracted thousands every August. In parallel, Martin Bormann, who vanished the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, near Lehrter Bahnhof station with a cyanide capsule, was found in 1972 by construction workers and confirmed through DNA in 1998 using records from the same dentist who treated Hitler, Hugo Blaschke. Science took decades to close what myth had kept alive. This documentary reveals what happened to the graves and bodies of the Third Reich's leaders. Adolf Hitler, the fake skull that defied history for decades. For half a century, a skull bone fragment with a bullet hole on the left side was presented to the world as the definitive physical proof of Adolf Hitler's death. It was preserved at the Russian State Archive in Moscow, the GARF. In 2009, a DNA analysis revealed that bone almost certainly did not belong to Hitler. It belonged to a woman between 20 and 40 years old. The correction, led by archaeologist Nick Bellantoni and geneticist Linda Strausbauer of the University of Connecticut, did not resurrect the dictator, but exposed how a single wrong piece had sustained a certainty for decades, and forced science to ask what authentic evidence truly remained. The origin of the problem lies in the spring of 1945. In early May, as the Red Army seized Berlin, the Soviet counterintelligence unit Smersh combed the garden of the Reich Chancellery. In a shell crater beside the bunker's emergency exit, they found partially charred remains. Hitler had ordered that his body and Eva Braun's be doused with gasoline and burned to avoid the fate of Mussolini's corpse, displayed upside down in a Milan square just days before. His aides poured fuel over the bodies between 4 and 6:30 in the afternoon of April 30th, under Soviet artillery fire. The cremation, carried out hastily and with insufficient fuel in the open air, was incomplete. What the Soviets collected was not a recognizable body, but blackened fragments. The Soviets buried, exhumed, and relocated those remains several times in the following months, a chain of movements that would later make it nearly impossible to reconstruct with certainty what was preserved and what was lost. Identification then depended on the teeth. The Soviets located Käthe Häusermann, assistant to Hitler's personal dentist, Hugo Blaschke. Häusermann knew the dictator's dentition from memory, a mouth ruined by bridges, crowns, and highly unusual prosthetics that Blaschke had built for him over the years. When shown a jawbone and a dental bridge recovered from the remains, she recognized them immediately, precisely describing the crown and the distinctive upper jaw bridge even before seeing them completely. They also identified Eva Braun's dental remains thanks to dental technician Fritz Echtmann, who had made a bridge for her. That identification, carried out days after the fall of Berlin, was for a long time the most solid basis for Hitler's death. Häusermann's cooperation did her no good. She was deported to the Soviet Union and spent years in isolation and in the Gulag, precisely because she knew too much. Stalin, for political reasons, preferred ambiguity. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, he even claimed Hitler had not died and was probably hiding in Spain or Argentina. It was deliberate disinformation, a way to keep the Allies confused and to pressure governments that might be sheltering Nazi fugitives. From June 1945 onward, the Soviet apparatus in fact spread two contradictory narratives simultaneously: that Hitler had died by cyanide and that he had survived and fled, sowing a doubt that would germinate into decades of theories about escapes, submarines, and secret bases. West Germany would not issue an official death certificate until 1956, following a lengthy judicial review. Those theories have a documented starting point, and it is worth knowing it. On July 10, 1945, more than 2 months after the German surrender, a German submarine surfaced off the Argentine naval base of Mar del Plata and surrendered. It was the U-530, an ocean-going submarine of Type 9C/40, commanded by a young officer, Otto Wermuth, just 24 years old. What was strange was not only the delay, but the details. The voyage had lasted longer than expected, the crew carried no documentation, the navigation log had vanished, and the deck gun had been thrown overboard. 5 weeks later, on August 17, 1945, a second submarine, the U-977, under Heinz Schäfer, surrendered at the same port. Schäfer would claim his vessel had sailed submerged for 66 consecutive days in a journey of nearly 100 days from Europe, made possible by the snorkel that allowed the diesels to run at periscope depth. The coincidence immediately ignited imaginations. Barely a week after the U-530's arrival, Hungarian exile Ladislau Szabó published a detailed account in an Argentine newspaper of how Hitler and his entourage had supposedly escaped Germany by sea. The story spread worldwide, and years later he collected it into a book. In coastal towns of the Buenos Aires province, testimonies circulated from residents claiming to have seen periscopes off their beaches, empty drifting boats and metal tanks washed ashore near estates owned by Germans. The hypothesis was refined. Hitler had flown by small aircraft to a northern German port, boarded a submarine, and quietly disembarked on the Patagonian coast before the vessel continued to Mar del Plata to stage a routine surrender. Some versions added a third submarine, the U-3523, an advanced Type 21 model capable of long dives, which indeed disappeared at the end of the war. It was said to have sunk after leaving Hitler ashore. The mention of a hidden base in Antarctica, in Queen Maud Land, completed the most fantastical picture. The concrete facts are true. The U-530 and U-977 existed, arrived in Argentina, and surrendered on those dates. But their crews were exhaustively interrogated by Argentine, American, and British naval personnel. The commanders maintained they carried no significant passengers, that they had chosen Argentina as a friendly country and out of fear of what awaited them at Allied hands, and that the voyage anomalies were due to the need to save fuel by sailing on the surface at night and submerged by day. Investigators concluded both arrivals were harmless and released the crews. Schäfer himself later published a book defending that his voyage concealed no secret passenger. The fate of the U-3523 remained a mystery for decades. Only in 2018 did the Danish Maritime Museum locate its wreck off the coast of Skagen, sunk by a British Liberator bomber in May 1945, plunged bow first into the seabed with no trace of the legendary landings. Many of the alleged Hitler sightings that American intelligence itself collected after the war were investigated at the time and dismissed as hoaxes, confusions, or rumors spread to inconvenience the Soviets. Hitler's physical remains, meanwhile, remained locked in Soviet archives, inaccessible to Western science. The skull fragment with the bullet hole was unearthed from the archives in 1993 and displayed publicly in an exhibition in Moscow in the year 2000, presented as the Führer's skull. It was that exhibition that ultimately began dismantling one piece of the myth. In 2009, Nick Bellantoni obtained permission to take small samples from the fragment using swabs, and the subsequent genetic analysis yielded markers consistent with a young woman, with cranial sutures too fine to belong to a 56-year-old man. The question of the Soviet chain of custody, whose bone that was and how it came to be labelled as Hitler's, remains without a clear answer. It is worth clarifying the scope. The correction eliminated one piece of the file, but not the jawbone and teeth, which were and remain the central evidence. And the underlying scientific question was a different one. Were there any authentic remains left analyzable with modern methods? The answer came nearly a decade later, and it came from France. In March and July of 2017, the Russian Secret Service, FSB, together with the State Archives, authorized for the first time since 1946 a team of foreign researchers to directly examine the remains. Leading the effort was Philippe Charlier, a French forensic physician and paleopathologist specializing in historical cold cases, known for having analyzed supposed remains of Henry IV of France and of Robespierre. Charlier did not examine only the disputed skull fragment, but something more reliable, the preserved jawbone and teeth, the latter kept with macabre irony in a Soviet cigarette box inside the FSB archives. The work consisted of a direct osteological and morphological inspection, first with the naked eye and then under a binocular magnifier, followed by minimal sampling for scanning, electron microscope analysis, and elemental studies. They had a few hours to examine the pieces without being able to remove them from the building. What Charlier found, published in May 2018 in the European Journal of Internal Medicine and co-signed by 4 other researchers, was conclusive within its limits. The teeth presented prosthetics, bridges and dental work so unusual and specific that they matched exactly the descriptions of the dentists who had made them and with the Soviet autopsy reports of 1945. They were not a replica fabricated by the KGB, as some theorists suspected. They belonged to someone of that era and those characteristics. Charlier observed white tartar deposits and a complete absence of meat fibers, consistent with Hitler's vegetarianism, and detected bluish deposits on the dentures compatible with a chemical reaction between cyanide and the metal of the prosthetics. The absence of gunpowder residue on the teeth indicated that, if there was a shot, it was not in the mouth, but more likely in the temple, neck, or forehead. On the cause of death, his conclusion was cautious. Hitler most probably used both methods simultaneously, a cyanide capsule to ensure the outcome and a gunshot. The teeth are authentic, there is no possible doubt. Our study proves that Hitler died in 1945, Charlier told AFP. He did not flee to Argentina in a submarine. He is not in a hidden base in Antarctica or on the dark side of the moon. Charlier himself acknowledged that a visual and microscopic analysis could not by itself prove to whom the skull fragment belonged, and his work was criticized for relying substantially on the Soviet autopsy account without addressing all alternative hypotheses. What the study did firmly establish is the authenticity of the jawbone and teeth, and with it the central conclusion: the man whose dental remains Moscow holds is without reasonable ambiguity Adolf Hitler. The fate of the rest of the body became known through the opening of Soviet archives. After the fall of Berlin, Hitler's and Braun's remains were buried, exhumed, and reburied several times, until coming to rest under a Soviet military installation in Magdeburg at Westenstrasse 36, where they were interred again in February 1946 alongside the remains of the Goebbels family and General Hans Krebs. In March 1970, as the barracks were to be handed over to East German authorities, KGB chief Yuri Andropov wrote to Leonid Brezhnev requesting permission to destroy the remains before the site could become a neo-Nazi shrine. The authorization, also signed by Alexei Kosygin and Nikolai Podgorny, arrived on March 17th. In the secret operation, codenamed Archivo, a KGB 3-agent unit, Colonel Kovalenko, Major Shirokov, and Lieutenant Vladimir Gumeniuk exhumed the remains on the night of April 4th to 5th, 1970, transported them near Schönebeck, crushed them, mixed them with charcoal, doused them with around 20 liters of gasoline, and incinerated them for approximately 1 hour. The ashes were collected in a sack and thrown from the Schweinebrücke Bridge into the Ehle River, a tributary of the Elbe west of Biederitz. Today there is no grave, no monument, no identifiable location, only a small watercourse that flows shortly after into Lake Biederitzer Sea. The jawbone and teeth remain in FSB custody in Moscow. The woman's skull fragment remains in the Russian State Archive. Science confirmed the essential, that Hitler died on April 30th, 1945, but failed to silence those who prefer the mystery, fed by the gaps that history itself left open. The wrong skull, the Russian archives always partially closed, the missing submarine. Hitler erased his own body. He was not the only regime leader who would end up without a grave, though in other cases the decision would be made by German authorities well into the 21st century. The grave of Hess that drew thousands of neo-Nazis and ended up disappearing. Every August, for nearly a quarter of a century, thousands of neo-Nazis from across Europe converged on a small Bavarian town, Wunsiedel, to visit a grave. On the headstone, beside the name, was an engraved phrase, "Ich hab's gewagt," I dared. It was the tomb of Rudolf Hess, and for the European far right it had become an open-air altar. Hess died on August 17, 1987, in Spandau Prison in West Berlin, at the age of 93. The physical circumstances of his death are the root of all subsequent controversy, so they are worth detailing. That afternoon he was permitted, as every day, to retire to a small wooden shed in the prison garden, a structure he used to rest and read outdoors. When the American guard watching him stepped away briefly and returned, he found Hess on the floor of the shed with an electrical extension cord around his neck. The cord was tied to the window handle. He was resuscitated without success on site and transferred to the British military hospital in Berlin, where his death was certified. The official version of the four Allied powers that administered Spandau on rotating turns, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, was intentional death by hanging. Skepticism arose almost immediately and did not come only from Nazi nostalgists. The central argument was physical. Hess was 93 years old, suffered from severe arthritis, could barely raise his arms above his head, and had hands so weak that, according to testimonies, he needed help with tasks as basic as tying his shoes. Critics argued that a man in that condition could hardly have tied a cord to a window handle positioned at a certain height and generated the tension needed to strangle himself in a shed where there was no sufficient drop for a conventional hanging. The mechanism would have required him to press his weight against the cord in a sustained way, a demanding act for someone of his frailty. The primary driver of the assassination thesis was his son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, who devoted the rest of his life to maintaining that his father had been executed and wrote several books on the subject. He drew on British military pathologist Hugh Thomas, author of works on the case, who examined the evidence and raised medical objections. Thomas argued that the marks on Hess's neck, in his reading a strangulation line more horizontal than one would expect from a suspension hanging, were more consistent with strangulation by a third party than with self-inflicted death. The family also alleged irregularities, that the garden shed was demolished shortly after the death, preventing a complete forensic examination of the scene, and that access to documentation was restricted. Another point of friction was the farewell note. A letter attributed to Hess, addressed to his family, was found, which authorities presented as his final message. But those close to him noted that the text appeared to correspond to a note written years earlier, during a serious illness in 1969, and not a message drafted on the day of his death, which fueled suspicion that it was not an authentic farewell note, but a reused document. The family's alternative hypothesis maintained that Hess had been strangled by agents to prevent his release, believed imminent on humanitarian grounds given his advanced age. According to this theory, the Soviet Union had always opposed releasing him. He was the only remaining prisoner in Spandau, and his release would have meant the prison's closure and the end of Soviet presence in West Berlin. And furthermore, Hess knew sensitive details of the 1941 peace negotiations. None of this has been conclusively proven. Subsequent official investigations, including a review by the German Public Prosecutor's Office, upheld the official version of his death, but the zone of shadow never fully dissipated. To understand why Hess's death fascinated the far right, one must go back to the strangest episode of his life, the flight to Scotland. On May 10, 1941, Hess, then the Führer's deputy in the Nazi Party, took off alone in a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter from Augsburg, crossed the North Sea and parachuted over Scottish territory near Glasgow after running out of fuel. His stated objective was to contact sectors of the British aristocracy, specifically the Duke of Hamilton, to negotiate a separate peace between Germany and Great Britain before the imminent invasion of the Soviet Union. He was immediately captured by a local farmer armed with a pitchfork. The great question, which continues to fuel books and debates, is whether he acted on his own initiative, in the impulse of a man increasingly marginalized within Hitler's circle, or whether the mission had some tacit knowledge from the Führer. Hitler publicly repudiated him immediately and declared him a madman who had acted alone. That ambiguity turned Hess, in the eyes of his post-war admirers, into a useful figure for the myth, the prisoner jailed for life for seeking peace. The narrative was false at its core. Hess was a convinced Nazi from the 1920s, a cellmate of Hitler after the 1923 Munich Putsch, and a collaborator in drafting Mein Kampf, which the dictator dictated to him in large part in Landsberg prison. After the flight, Hess spent the rest of the war as a British prisoner, briefly even in the Tower of London. At the Nuremberg trials he was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace and conspiracy, though he was acquitted of the charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He served his sentence in Spandau, a large prison built in 1876 and designed for hundreds of inmates that, during its final 21 years, since the release of Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach in 1966, held a single man, guarded by the four powers on monthly rotations at enormous cost. When he died, the authorities did to the building what they would later do to his grave. The prison was demolished to its foundations within weeks, its rubble crushed and secretly disposed of, part thrown into the North Sea, part buried, with a declared aim that the site not become a neo-Nazi pilgrimage point. A shopping centre for British Forces families was built on its grounds, but the grave remained. Hess had been buried, per his wish, in the family plot of the Wunsiedel cemetery, beside his parents. Year after year, around the anniversary of his August death, the European far right organised marches and gatherings that devolved into Hitler salutes among the cemetery's headstones, drawing participants from multiple countries. For residents, it was a recurring shame that stigmatised the town. For the neo-Nazi movement, Hess was the martyr of peace. The very existence of the grave, a physical geolocatable point with a defiant headstone, sustained and ritualised the myth, to the point that authorities banned the marches on several occasions without managing to extinguish them. The resolution came in 2011 thanks to an administrative detail. The plot's lease expired that year, and the Lutheran Evangelical Church that owned the land, weary of the disturbances, refused to renew the contract when Hess's descendants requested an extension. After negotiations and initial objections from the family, the heirs gave their consent to a radical solution. The operation was carried out discreetly. Before dawn on Wednesday, July 20th, 2011, a date coinciding with the anniversary of Operation Valkyrie's assassination attempt against Hitler in 1944, cemetery workers exhumed the remains. The cemetery administrator, Andreas Fabel, confirmed it with a brief statement. The grave is now empty. The bones are gone. The remains were transferred to a crematorium and the ashes secretly scattered at sea, at a deliberately undisclosed location so that a site of homage could never be identified. The headstone bearing "I dared" was removed and dismantled, and the grave levelled and filled with earth. Where for 24 years there had been a monument to which pilgrims travelled, nothing remained. The parallel was inevitable. A few months earlier, in May 2011, the United States had buried Osama bin Laden's body at sea with the same logic of denying a physical burial site. Some nationalist groups explicitly drew that comparison to denounce the exhumation as a desecration. Charlotte Knobloch, former president of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, celebrated instead the end of what she called the brown ghost of Wunsiedel. The effect on neo-Nazi gatherings was measurable. Deprived of their physical epicenter, the annual events in Wunsiedel lost momentum. The town also developed a celebrated response, the 2014 Rechts gegen Rechts, Right Against Right initiative, which converted every meter walked by far-right demonstrators into a donation from local sponsors to Exit Deutschland, a program to help people leave the neo-Nazi movement, turning the march into an involuntary fundraiser against itself. Today, no grave of Rudolf Hess exists, no headstone, no plot, no coordinates any visitor could search for. 8 years later, in Berlin, someone would open another Nazi grave at night, a far more hidden one, and this time it would not be the authorities who desecrated it. The secret burial of Heydrich and the mysterious nocturnal robbery. On December 12, 2019, an employee of the Invalidenfriedhof in Berlin discovered that the earth of a specific grave had been disturbed during the night. The pit had no name, no headstone, no cross, no plaque. Its location was, in theory, a secret that only a few people knew, and yet someone had located it with precision in the darkness and opened it. Beneath that unmarked earth lay the remains of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the architects of the Holocaust. Heydrich was head of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, which encompassed the Gestapo and the Security Service SD. He presided over the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, where the logistics of the extermination of European Jews were coordinated. He was known as the Butcher of Prague, and Hitler nicknamed him the Man with the Iron Heart. He had joined the SS in 1931 after being expelled from the Navy over an honor matter involving a woman, and in less than a decade had become one of the most powerful and feared men in the regime. The nature of his death, slow and almost accidental, made him a relic for some and a target for others. On May 27, 1942, on a sharp bend in the road in the Liban district on the outskirts of Prague, two Czechoslovak paratroopers trained by the British Special Operations Executive, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, deployed in Operation Anthropoid, ambushed Heydrich's open-top Mercedes, which travelled without an escort and with the roof down out of pure arrogance, convinced that his authority made him untouchable. The plan almost failed. Gabčík's Sten submachine gun jammed at point-blank range as the car slowed on the bend. But Kubis threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded against the right rear side of the vehicle. And here is the detail that would decide history. Heydrich was not fatally struck by the shrapnel itself. The explosion projected into his body fragments of the car itself, pieces of bodywork, strips of upholstery leather, and above all horsehair, the material stuffing the seats of that Mercedes. Those organic fibers, laden with bacteria, penetrated alongside the shrapnel along the wound paths in his left side and abdomen. Heydrich, despite the wound, managed to exit the car and fire his pistol at the attackers before collapsing. He was transferred to Bulovka Hospital in Prague in the back of a delivery van, arriving around noon and undergoing emergency surgery. The surgeons, led by German and Czech specialists, performed a thoracotomy to treat a pneumothorax on the left side, removed the damaged spleen, sutured a tear in the diaphragm, and treated the tail of the pancreas and placed drainage tubes. During the procedure, they found embedded in the wound those tiny particles of leather and horsehair upholstery, along with grenade fragments and metal splinters. After the operation, his condition appeared to stabilize. He received blood transfusions and injections against gangrene and tetanus, and for several days the medical reports were cautiously optimistic. But then politics entered the scene. Himmler sent from Berlin his trusted physician, SS surgeon Karl Gebhardt, to take charge of the case over the attending doctors. Czech staff were even barred from accessing the ward. Gebhardt made conservative decisions that, in light of later medicine, were probably wrong. He banned further X-rays and ruled out reoperation to thoroughly clean the wound. And crucially, Heydrich was not given a full course of sulfonamides, the first antibiotics of the era, despite the appearance of fever, an unmistakable sign of infection. Other doctors, including Hitler's personal surgeon Theodor Morell, went so far as to suggest using a sulfonamide preparation. But Gebhardt maintained his position that the infection should be resolved surgically rather than pharmacologically. Over the following days, the infection spread throughout the body. On the seventh day, Heydrich managed to sit up in bed to eat, but suddenly collapsed and fell into a coma. He died in the early hours of June 4, 1942. The autopsy, performed in Prague, confirmed the cause: massive septicemia, a sepsis affecting vital organs triggered by bacterial contamination from the horsehair fibers and foreign bodies lodged in his organs. He died in the most literal sense because of the stuffing of his own car. The medical matter had an atrocious sequel that connects directly to the horror of the regime. Gebhardt was criticized in medical circles for not having used sufficient sulfonamide and for his management of the case. To defend his position, according to which the antibiotics of the era were ineffective against a deep infection and the only valid approach was traditional surgery, he organized from the summer of 1942 at the Ravensbrück women's concentration camp a series of criminal experiments. Prisoners, mostly young Polish resistance women, had incisions made in their legs, bones fractured, and wounds deliberately infected with bacteria such as streptococcus, as well as dirt, glass fragments, and wood splinters introduced to simulate contaminated war wounds. One group received sulfonamide and the other did not, to prove that the drug was useless. Many of the victims, known as the Ravensbrück rabbits, died or were left mutilated for life. Heydrich's death thus generated a new chapter of medical atrocity. Gebhardt was tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, sentenced to death, and executed at Landsberg prison in June 1948. The regime gave Heydrich one of the most lavish state funerals in the entire history of the Third Reich, with successive ceremonies in Prague and Berlin, and a cortege presided over by Hitler himself, who placed his highest decorations on the coffin. He was buried in the Invalidenfriedhof, the capital's military cemetery, among the graves of Prussian marshals and heroes, with the intention of later erecting a monumental memorial that was never built. The reprisal for his death was of immeasurable cruelty. On June 10, 1942, German forces razed the Czech village of Lidice, shot approximately 173 men, deported the women to Ravensbrück, and sent nearly all the children to their deaths at Chelmno, in addition to executing thousands more in a wave of reprisals across the Protectorate. The two paratroopers and their comrades were cornered days later in the crypt of the Orthodox Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague, where they died fighting or took their own lives to avoid capture. After the war, the Allied occupation forces decreed that the monuments and headstones of prominent Nazis should be removed to prevent them from becoming places of worship. Heydrich's headstone was dismantled, as was that of Armaments Minister Fritz Todt, buried in the same cemetery. But his remains were never exhumed. They stayed there underground, in a grave that from then on bore no marking whatsoever. That decision was compounded by the geography of the Cold War. The Invalidenfriedhof, founded in 1748 by order of Frederick II of Prussia as a cemetery for disabled soldiers and transformed over 2 centuries into one of Germany's most important military pantheons, where figures such as General Gerhard von Scharnhorst and aviation ace Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, rested, became trapped right in the border strip of the Berlin Wall. In 1951, the East Berlin authorities closed the cemetery to the public, and with the wall's construction in 1961, many of the headstones were knocked down to clear the killing zone's field of fire. A portion of the cemetery was directly demolished to build the border installations. Heydrich's grave thus became doubly invisible, unnamed and in a militarized zone that virtually no one could access. Its exact location became what Germans call an open secret, known to historians, archivists and cemetery specialists, transmitted in scholarly studies and plans, but never marked on the ground. That is why what happened in December 2019 was so alarming. The Berlin police opened a formal investigation for the offence of grave desecration, classified in the German Penal Code. German media reported, and the police confirmed, that apparently no remains had been taken. The bones were still in place. But the investigators' conclusion was what was disturbing. Whoever opened that grave did not act randomly. Since nothing on the surface identified the location, the perpetrators must have possessed precise insider knowledge of its whereabouts. It was not random vandalism, but a targeted intervention at a point that only a small circle of people could have known. It was never publicly clarified who did it, or with what intention. The hypotheses contradict one another. On one hand, neo-Nazi sympathizers seeking relics or physical contact with the remains of a figure venerated in the darkest corners of extremism. On the other, activists from the opposite extreme intending to symbolically desecrate and destroy the grave. The precedent was concrete. In 2000, a radical left-wing group claimed to have opened in another Berlin cemetery what they said was the grave of Nazi Horst Wessel, turned by the regime into a martyr and honored with an SA anthem, and to have thrown his skull into the Spree River. Police later maintained that they had actually opened the grave of Wessel's father and that no bones had been removed. That impossibility of knowing whether Heydrich's grave was violated out of devotion or hatred made the case even harder to interpret, and the investigation was closed without any known arrests. The uncertain fate of Heinrich Müller. No grave, no confirmed DNA. Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, is the highest-ranking figure of the Nazi leadership, whose death was never irrefutably confirmed. There is no recognized grave, no body identified by science beyond all doubt, no DNA analysis. Only a documentary trail that breaks off on May 1, 1945, and a mass grave in which, in all probability, his bones rest mixed with those of thousands of unknowns. Müller directed the Gestapo from September 1939, when the secret police was integrated as Department 4 within the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, under Reinhard Heydrich. He was the executive arm of Nazi terror, the detection and suppression of every form of opposition, inside and outside Germany. He attended the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, where the administrative machinery of the extermination of European Jews was coordinated, and managed the operational details of deportation through Adolf Eichmann, who answered to him. They called him Gestapo Müller to distinguish him from another SS general of the same surname. Born in Munich on April 28, 1900, he was a cold and meticulous police bureaucrat, not a frontline ideologue, which paradoxically made him harder to track. A man trained in the methods of surveillance and clandestinity knew better than anyone how to erase his own traces. His last documented appearance occurred on May 1, 1945, in the Reich Chancellery bunker, one day after Hitler's death. Around him, the regime's inner circle was disintegrating amid deaths and attempts to flee through a city falling to the Red Army. From that moment on, Müller vanishes from the verifiable record. There is no coherent and verified testimony of what he did afterward, nor of how or when he died. That abrupt interruption fueled for 80 years one of the greatest documentary mysteries of the war's end. For decades, the void was filled with sightings from around the world. It was said that Müller had been seen in Czechoslovakia, in Cuba, in Argentina. A more elaborate version, born in the midst of the Cold War, maintained that the expert in police repression apparatus had been recruited by the East and was working in 1951 as the right-hand man of the Stasi chief in Communist Germany. The hypothesis even appeared backed by a communiqué from the West German Federal Army's news service, the Bundeswehr. In 1961, Polish defector Michał Golanewski, deputy chief of his country's military counterintelligence, fueled the Soviet recruitment version. In July 1988, writer Ian Sayer received from an anonymous sender a 427-page dossier, presented as a copy of a U.S. Army counterintelligence corps file, claiming that Müller had survived and worked as an intelligence advisor for the Americans. The CIA, the U.S. Office of Special Investigations, the Mossad, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center maintained files on him for years. No one wanted the Gestapo's operational mastermind to be alive and serving the opposing side. The difficulty was compounded by a mundane detail. Heinrich Müller is an extremely common name in German, and the Allies located many Heinrich Müllers in occupied Germany and Austria, but never the one they were looking for. Against the survival theories, there always existed the sober hypothesis that Müller never left Berlin, that he died in those final days, and that his body ended up in one of the countless improvised graves in which the devastated city buried its dead. The problem was that an anonymous corpse in a mass grave leaves no trail enabling later identification. The key testimony came in 1963, when West German authorities were investigating the rumor that Müller was buried in Berlin's Neukölln district. A former Volkssturm member, gravedigger Walter Lüders, told police that he himself had been part of a burial unit that in 1945 found the body of an SS general in the Chancellery Garden with Heinrich Müller's identity documents on his person, and that he had recognized him by his face when checking it against the papers. Lüders specified that there were 3 mass graves in a former Jewish cemetery in central Berlin, and that Müller lay in one of them. His statement was not confirmed at the time and was set aside. The witness's credibility was questioned, and above all the location identified, the Jewish cemetery on Gross Hamburger Strasse, had ended up on the other side of the wall in the Soviet sector, so Western authorities could not investigate it. An article in the academic journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies noted in 2001 that the gravedigger's account was known but had never been verifiable for that geographical reason. The turning point came in October 2013. Johannes Tuchel, director of the German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin, announced that he had located in the city's archives documents supporting the account of the death in Berlin, found while researching an episode in which Müller had ordered the execution of 18 resistance members at the war's end. Among those papers was a death certificate from December 1945, registered by the Mitte district office, in which the burial location was listed as the Jewish cemetery. Tuchel reconstructed the body's itinerary. In August 1945, a corpse clearing unit had discovered and identified a body in a general's uniform in a provisional grave in the garden of the former Luftwaffe headquarters. The identification was based on the military ID with photograph that the corpse carried in its pocket and on the decorations, which were subsequently handed to military authorities to be returned to the family. Those remains were later transferred, along with some 3,000 other dead, to a mass grave in the Jewish cemetery on Grosse Hamburger Strasse. Tuchel described the evidence as clear and unambiguous, and said he had no explanation for why the intelligence services that had searched for him for decades had not found the same documents. "That is a piece of the puzzle I cannot answer," he admitted. The detail of the location carries bitter irony. One of the principal organizers of the Holocaust would have ended up buried, anonymously, in one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in Berlin, founded in the 17th century, the same where philosopher Moses Mendelssohn rests. The cemetery had been desecrated and ravaged by the SS themselves in 1943, who dug trenches through it. By the end of the war, its 16 mass graves held more than 2,700 victims of Allied bombing and the Battle of Berlin. Dieter Graumann, then president of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, called the news a monstrosity in poor taste and denounced it as a violation of the victims' memory. Andreas Nachama, head of the Topography of Terror Documentation Center and former leader of the Berlin Jewish community, clarified that Müller's presence there, though grotesque, had not been a deliberate anti-Jewish measure. In the chaos of the post-war period, all human remains found in the area had been buried together without distinction. Here, the Müller case parts ways with all the others. Tuchel found solid documentary evidence: the death certificate, the burial unit's report, the claimed testimony of Lüders, but no forensic confirmation. There is no DNA analysis of Müller, and there cannot be. His body, if it lies where the documents indicate, rests indistinguishable among thousands of others in a mass grave that no one will ever exhume. Jewish religious law prohibits exhumation, and the integrity of a historic cemetery with centuries-old graves makes it unthinkable to disturb it in search of a Nazi criminal's remains. Ephraim Zuroff, the Simon Wiesenthal Center's chief Nazi hunter, expressed caution at the 2013 announcement. Only a DNA test would prove that Müller is buried in Berlin, he warned, noting that Nazis who wanted to escape often forged documents to fake their own deaths. Not even since German reunification has anyone attempted to excavate the site. In the strictest sense, therefore, the Müller case has not been closed with the finality of others. The documentary evidence points strongly to Berlin and to that anonymous grave, and the theories of flight to South America or recruitment by the Stasi lack material support and are today considered highly unlikely. But the absence of an identified body leaves a gap that science has been unable to seal. Müller remains the only one of the regime's major leaders whose fate we know with reasonable probability, but not with forensic certainty. Other Nazis, whose end was for decades equally uncertain, did eventually come to resolution in the most definitive way possible, with a skeleton on an autopsy table and a genetic profile admitting no dispute. The first of them crossed the Atlantic and lived 30 more years under false names. Joseph Mengele, the bones that spoke 30 years later. On June 6, 1985, two gravediggers broke open with a pickaxe an overgrown tomb in the cemetery of Nossa Senhora do Rosário in Embu, on the outskirts of São Paulo. The headstone bore the name of Wolfgang Gerhard, a deceased Austrian. But the body beneath that red clay was not his. It belonged to the man who had used that borrowed name for years, Auschwitz physician Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, the most wanted Nazi war criminal on the planet. Unlike Müller, Mengele was going to be identified bone by bone. To understand how that exhumation came about, one must trace the escape. Mengele had carried out atrocious experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, obsessed with twins, heterochromia and hereditary diseases, and abandoned the camp in January 1945, shortly before the Soviet arrival. He dissolved into the millions of post-war displaced persons and in 1949 fled to Argentina, aided by the escape networks of former SS members. He lived first around Buenos Aires with relative visibility, but the capture of Adolf Eichmann by the Israeli Mossad in Buenos Aires in 1960 changed the rules. Mengele understood that he was no longer safe. He had moved to Paraguay in 1959, a country that even granted him citizenship, and from there to Brazil in 1960, where he began an increasingly furtive existence. He was simultaneously sought by West Germany, which issued extradition requests, the State of Israel, and Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal. They never caught him. Mengele died on February 7, 1979, in an almost banal manner. He was at the coastal resort of Bertioga in the state of São Paulo, visiting an Austrian couple, Wolfram and Liselotte Bosser, who had sheltered and protected him. While swimming in the sea, he suffered a stroke, not his first, and drowned. He was 67 years old. The Bosserts buried him discreetly under the name of Wolfgang Gerhard, the identity Mengele had used since 1971. borrowed from a real Austrian Nazi who had returned to Europe and handed over his documents. The grave belonged to the Gerhard family, who had already buried a relative there. The secret held for 6 years. Those who knew stayed silent to protect the network of people who had sheltered him. What broke the case was the patient tracing of old connections. On May 31, 1985, police, acting on information from the West German Public Prosecutor's Office as part of a coordinated operation between Germany, Israel and the United States, searched in Günzburg, Mengeler's hometown in Bavaria, the house of Hans Sedlmayr, the criminal's lifelong friend and sales manager of the family business. They found an address book in code and copies of letters exchanged with Mengele over the years, including one from Wolfram Bossert reporting his death. German authorities alerted the Sao Paulo police, who located and interrogated the Bosserts. They confessed to having sheltered Mengele and revealed the exact location of the grave in Embu. The remains were exhumed on June 6th. The skeleton became the subject of one of the most meticulous osteological investigations of its time, led by an international team of anthropologists and forensic pathologists that included Brazilian pathologist Daniel Romero Munoz. The experts read the bones data point by data point. They determined sex, male, laterality, right-handed, height, around 174 centimeters, build and age at death, placed in a range consistent with Mengele's 67 years. They studied the skull and compared its morphology with photographs of the criminal using image superimposition techniques, projecting the skull and portraits at the same scale to verify the match of features. They analyzed old injuries reflected in the bones and cross-referenced them with his known history. A fracture in the left pelvis matched a motorcycle accident Mengele had suffered at Auschwitz, as recorded in his military file. The dentition was a decisive piece. The upper jaw presented a complete dental prosthesis, and the lower jaw retained a few natural teeth, and everything was compared with German dental records going back to 1937, including the characteristic gap between the upper central incisors visible in old photographs. There were almost novelistic details that reinforced the hypothesis. The body had not been buried with arms crossed, as is customary in Brazil, but with arms extended at the sides, and in the letters found in Günzburg, Mengele had left in writing the instruction to be buried in that position. Brazilian police confirmed that a drowning had indeed been recorded in Bertioga on the indicated day in 1979. And strikingly, just a few months after that death, the Paraguayan government had revoked without explanation the citizenship it had granted him, as if it already knew he would no longer need it. With all of this, the forensic team concluded in 1985 that beyond any reasonable doubt, the remains were those of Josef Mengele. His son, Rolf Mengele, confirmed it publicly on June 10th, stating that the body was his father's and that the news of his death had been concealed to protect those who had sheltered him. But forensic anthropology works with probabilities, and the conclusion with a high degree of probability left a margin that some skeptics exploited, keeping alive the suspicion that those bones were not the angel of deaths. The definitive word came from genetics, and it took 7 more years. In 1992, a team led by British geneticist Alec Jeffreys, pioneer of the genetic fingerprinting technique at the University of Leicester, together with Maxine Allen, Erika Hogelberg and Andreas Sonberg, succeeded in extracting minimal quantities of highly degraded DNA from the interior of the diaphysis of a femur from the skeleton. Despite the presence of a powerful inhibitor that hindered amplification, they reproducibly amplified microsatellite alleles and compared them with DNA samples from Mengele's son Rolf and from the criminal's wife. The result was conclusive. The bone genotype was fully compatible with paternity of Mengele's son across 10 different loci, and fewer than one person in 1800 of an unrelated Caucasian population could have produced that match by chance. The DNA confirmed independently what osteology had suggested. The bones exhumed in Brazil were, without any doubt, those of Josef Mengele. The case ranked among the first celebrated examples of identification through ancient DNA, a milestone that stimulated the development of forensic genetics. The final fate of the remains takes a turn that distinguishes this case from all others. The family repeatedly refused to repatriate the remains to Germany, and the skeleton remained in the custody of the Instituto Médico Legal in Sao Paulo, stored there for more than 3 decades. Over time, Daniel Romero Munoz, one of the forensic scientists who identified them, and later a professor at the University of São Paulo's medical faculty, recognized that the bones could serve as exceptional teaching material. Today they are used in forensic medicine classes to teach students how to examine human remains and cross-reference osteological information with documents relating to a person. Mengelé's own injuries, the pelvic fracture linked to his motorcycle accident, the traces of his years of military service and his life in hiding, make him, according to Muñoz, an exemplary case for learning. The physician who perverted science to torture and murder in the name of racial theories ended up becoming an anatomical study object for training those who learn to restore identity to the dead. Mengelé's is one of the very few cases in this story that can be considered fully resolved, and by the most solid means: osteology, odontology, photographic superimposition, and finally DNA. 30 years of flight, false identities and rumors placing him hidden in every corner of South America dissolved before a femur that preserved, degraded but legible, its genetic message. The last of the Great Escape cases generated even more theories than Mengelé's, across more decades and more continents, and yet his remains had been lying all along, buried just meters from where a witness had sworn he saw him die. Martin Bormann, the fugitive who never left Berlin. While the world searched for Martin Bormann in the Paraguayan jungle and in Argentine towns, his bones had spent nearly 30 years underground in Berlin, just a few meters from where he had last been seen. For almost 3 decades, he was the quintessential Nazi fugitive, the shadow mastermind who had supposedly achieved what neither Hitler nor Mengele could, vanishing completely and rebuilding his life on the other side of the ocean. Bormann was the head of the party chancellery and Hitler's personal secretary, the man who controlled access to the Führer and the flow of documents, to the point that many considered him the second most powerful man in the Third Reich in the final years of the war. On the night of April 30th, 1945, he was present in the bunker during Hitler's end, helped carry the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun into the garden for cremation, and witnessed the ritual. He then transmitted the Führer's political testament to Admiral Dönitz and announced that he would go to meet him, but that meeting never took place. During the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, amid the evacuation attempt from the bunker as Berlin fell, Bormann disappeared. There were witnesses. Arthur Axmann, leader of the Hitler Youth, declared that on that night, near the Lehrter Bahnhof railway station, on Invalidenstrasse north of the Spree, he had seen the bodies of Bormann and a companion, SS physician Ludwig Stumpfegger, lying on the ground and apparently dead after a Soviet artillery strike. He admitted, however, that he had not been able to examine the corpses up close. A second witness, postman Albert Krumnow, claimed to have buried the 2 bodies on Soviet orders, but subsequent searches found no remains, and in the climate of post-war distrust, the word of a Nazi leader was not enough. The Soviets never claimed to have found Bormann's body. The absence of a corpse was the fuel of the legend. At the Nuremberg trials, Bormann was tried and sentenced to death in absentia in 1946, precisely because no one could confirm that he was dead. In 1954, a court in Berchtesgaden declared him legally deceased and confiscated his assets. But theories of his escape proliferated unchecked throughout the 1950s and 1960s, placing him in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, or Chile. In 1971, the German authorities officially declared the search closed, considering the disappearance unresolved. Barely a year later, the soil of Berlin surrendered its secret. On December 7, 1972, construction workers carrying out building work near the Lehrter Bahnhof unearthed 2 skeletons about 12 meters from the exact spot where Krumnow claimed to have buried them. The forensic investigation was conclusive by the standards of the time. One of the skeletons had the height, build and age compatible with those of Bormann. American forensic expert Reidar Sogneis reconstructed the missing man's dental records with the help of documentation recalled in 1945 by his former dentist Hugo Blaschke, the same dentist who had treated Hitler, and presented his findings to the 1974 World Dental Congress. A dental bridge found among the remains matched the description of the one Blaschke had fitted for Bormann, and the prosthesis aligned with the skeleton's jawbone. There was also an anatomical clue. The body showed an old clavicle injury consistent with a riding accident Bormann had suffered in 1939, a fracture that his own children had described. The second skeleton, of similar height to Stumpfegger, was attributed to the physician. The detail that linked the bone to the manner of death was something else entirely. In the jawbones of both skeletons, tiny glass fragments were found, consistent with the cyanide capsules that so many Nazi leaders carried with them in the final days. The conclusion that prevailed was that Bormann and Stumpfegger, trapped that night between Soviet lines and with no way out, bit down on their cyanide vials. They had not escaped. They had died a few hundred meters from the bunker on the very night of their disappearance, exactly where the witnesses had placed them. In April 1973, the West German government considered this evidence sufficient and officially declared Martin Bormann dead, a decision that the British newspaper Daily Express described as a cover-up by the Brandt government. Not even that closed the case. The 1972 identification was met with skepticism and fresh speculation. In 1995, writer Hugh Thomas, the same man who had questioned the death of Hess, published a book, Doppelgängers, claiming to have found forensic inconsistencies. He argued that the skull was coated in a reddish clay characteristic of Paraguay, whereas the subsoil of Berlin consists of yellow sand, suggesting that the body had been brought from South America and buried in Berlin to fake the death, and that certain dental work appeared to post-date 1945, possibly belonging to the 1950s. In 1996, alleged former British agent Christopher Crichton claimed in his book Operation JB that Bormann had been kidnapped by British intelligence in 1945 in order to gain access to the Nazi Party's bank accounts. An Argentine military commander even stated in a 2010 interview that he had met Bormann in Buenos Aires in 1952 and 1953 and had arranged his security. The idea that the great fugitive had lived for many years in South America refused to die. To put an end to the speculation, the German authorities turned, as in the Mengele case, to the definitive tool. In 1998, they ordered a genetic analysis of fragments from the skull. The study, based on mitochondrial DNA, compared sequences from the hypervariable regions HV1 and HV2 extracted from the remains with those of a living relative from Martin Bormann's maternal line. The result left no room for doubt. The sequences matched without a single difference, and that genetic pattern did not appear in a reference database of 1,500 Caucasian sequences. The conclusion was unequivocal. The bones found in 1972 were those of Martin Bormann. The legend of the escape was demolished by molecular biology. Bormann had never left Berlin. He had been dead since the early hours of May 2, 1945, and his body had lain underground for almost 30 years, while half the world searched for him alive in another hemisphere. The reddish clay on the skull, far from proving a Paraguayan origin, was explained by the specific type of soil at the burial site. The fate of the remains repeats the pattern of this entire story. On August 16, 1999, Bormann's bones were cremated, and his son, Martin Adolf Bormann, who had become a Catholic priest and devoted much of his life to confronting his father's legacy, scattered the ashes in the Baltic Sea. The reasoning was identical to that applied in the cases of Hitler, Hess, and so many others. No grave, no headstone, no identifiable physical location that might become a place of pilgrimage. Ashes in open waters leave no coordinates to visit. Decades of escape theories, entire books, sightings on 3 continents and Paraguayan clays were all demolished by a few bone fragments and a mitochondrial DNA sequence. A man who bit down on a cyanide capsule on a May night and fell a few meters from where a witness saw him fall. Between the absolute void of Müller and the complete resolution of the Mengele and Bormann cases lie the intermediate ones. Confirmed deaths wrapped in murky circumstances, remains whose fate raises new questions, and figures whose documented end continues to cast a shadow that neither science nor the archives have fully dispelled. The secret grave of Himmler, buried without a trace on the Lüneburg Heath. Of all the senior leaders of the Nazi regime, Heinrich Himmler is the only one whose body was handled, photographed, subjected to autopsy by the Allies, and buried by British soldiers, and of whom no grave, marker or known coordinate exists today. The architect of the SS, the Gestapo and the extermination machinery ended up in an anonymous pit on the Lüneburg Heath, and the handful of men who buried him took the secret of the exact location to their graves. It has never been recovered. It has never been subjected to modern forensic analysis. It is, in a sense, the mirror image of the Mengele case, a body that was in Allied hands, and that, despite this, was lost. The end began to take shape in the final days of the war. In April 1945, Himmler attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies on his own initiative through Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, and even explored an alliance against the Soviet Union. When Hitler found out, he declared him a traitor, stripped him of all his positions, and ordered his arrest. Cast aside by his own comrades and hunted by the Allies, Himmler tried to disappear. He shaved his moustache, covered his left eye with an eye patch, and obtained false documentation in the name of one Heinrich Hitzinger, actually spelled Heisinger in the original document, supposedly a sergeant in the German army. On May 11th, he left the Flensburg area with a small group of companions and headed south, with no fixed destination. The fall was almost routine. On May 21st, 1945, soldiers of the British 51st Highland Division were screening Germans and displaced persons at a bridge near Bremerwörde, a town in northern Germany between Hamburg and Bremerhaven, searching for war criminals and SS members subject to automatic arrest. 3 men in civilian clothing hesitated while crossing and drew attention. 2 of them had an obvious military bearing, and the third, Himmler, wore a mismatched blue overcoat over civilian clothes. A patrol from the 45th Field Security Section detained them without knowing who they had in front of them. Sergeants Arthur Britton and Ken Baysbrown drew up the report based on the false papers. Paradoxically, it was the very perfection of that documentation that aroused suspicion in a devastated country where nothing functioned with such efficiency. The 3 detainees were transferred to internment camp 031 at Barnstedt. After several days in custody and without being recognized, it was Himmler himself who gave himself away. On May 23rd, he declared to the camp commander, "I am Heinrich Himmler." The reaction was immediate. He was taken to a building at British Second Army headquarters in Lüneburg, stripped and thoroughly searched, under the arms, in the ears, in the hair, for poison. A small blue glass cyanide vial was found hidden in his clothing. When the medical officer, Captain Wells, examined his mouth, Himmler suddenly bit down on a second capsule he had concealed between his teeth. The interpreter and the officers present immediately flipped him over, plunged his head into a bowl of water, and tried to hold down his tongue to prevent him from swallowing the cyanide. But it was useless. The bitter almond smell of hydrogen cyanide spread through the room. The poison acted within about 15 minutes. Himmler died on the floor of that room, escaping the trial and the gallows that awaited the other Nazi leaders at Nuremberg. His captors left the body lying on the floor where it had fallen for 2 days. At least 1 death mask and plaster molds of the skull were taken. On May 25th, an autopsy was performed. The configuration of the teeth was cross-referenced to confirm his identity, and the brain along with parts of the skeleton were extracted for study. Only then came the burial, and this is the decision that explains why there is no grave today. The British did not want the resting place of the SS chief to ever become a site of pilgrimage or a relic for future nostalgics. The solution was a deliberately anonymous and secret burial. A small detachment was selected for the task, under the command of a major and directed on the ground by a sergeant major surnamed Austin, who before the war had worked in the sanitation department of his local council. 4 men accompanied him. The soldiers were bound to silence regarding the location. The site chosen was the Lüneburg Heath, a vast area of forest and peat bog south of the city, in the very setting where 3 weeks earlier the German army in the north had surrendered to Field Marshal Montgomery. It was wooded, marshy and virtually empty ground after the war, with more than enough spots to conceal a burial far from any eyes. There, the unembalmed body of Himmler was thrown into a pit without a coffin, without a headstone, without a cross, without any marker whatsoever. No public record of the exact location was made, no precise cartographic note was left, and the few who took part never disclosed it. That combination, a makeshift burial in the middle of an undistinguishable heath and a handful of witnesses sworn to secrecy, was enough for the location to be completely lost within a matter of years. The landscape, moreover, worked against any subsequent recovery. Across a uniform plain of heather and sand with no stable reference points, an anonymous pit becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain as soon as vegetation covers it. Over the following decades, that loss became permanent. Unlike Hitler, whose dental remains eventually ended up catalogued in Moscow, or Bormann and Mengele, who were exhumed and identified through DNA, Himmler's remains never resurfaced. There has been no official exhumation, no Himmler skeleton on a laboratory table, no modern genetic identification of his body has ever been carried out. The parts extracted by the British autopsy in 1945, the brain, skeletal fragments, have not led to any of the forensic confirmations that closed other files. What the void has generated is theories. The most sensational arrived in 2005, when researcher Martin Allen argued in a book and later in a Daily Telegraph investigation that Himmler had not died by his own hand, but had been murdered on Winston Churchill's orders to silence a man who knew too much. The Telegraph itself commissioned a forensic examination from expert Audrey Giles, who dismantled the thesis. Although the paper and the typewriter used in the supposed secret documents were genuine 1945 materials, the letterheads had been printed with a high-resolution laser printer developed in the 1990s, and one of the signatures had first been traced in pencil and then gone over in ink. The documents were a forgery. The official account of his death, attested by several British officers present in the room, stands. The result is that 80 years later, Heinrich Himmler has no locatable grave. The head of the SS shares the fate that the authorities sought for almost all the major names of the regime, no tomb, no place of tribute. But his case has its own particular nuance, whereas in other instances the disappearance of the grave was a calculated decision made over fully identified remains. In his case, the absence is also an absence of evidence. His body was seen, photographed and autopsied by reliable witnesses in 1945, so his death is not in question. But those remains have never been subjected to the molecular scrutiny that dispelled the legends surrounding Bormann or Mengele. Himmler certainly died on that floor in Lüneburg on May 23, 1945. Where exactly his bones lie today, somewhere lost on the heath, is a question that will probably never be answered.